with like 90 on.
Okay.
Vennligst reis opp. Vennligst reis opp.
Good afternoon and welcome to this public defense of the thesis entitled From Risk to Response, Musculoskeletal Health of Wheelchair Users and Benefits of High-Load Resistance Training. Today's candidate, Linn Christin Risvang, completed her thesis in September 2025. Based on the proposal from the Department of Physical Performance, the Research Committee of Norwegian School of Sports Sciences has appointed the following committee to judge the thesis and other requirements for the award. Professor Lena Nette Hogstad, Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, the chair. Professor Craig Sale, Manchester Metropolitan University, first opponent. Professor Victoria Louise Tolfrey, Loughborough University, second opponent. The committee has concluded that the thesis meets the standard worthy of a public defense for the award of Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Sports Science. Earlier today, the candidate has given a trial lecture with the title, Why do exercise interventions that work in the laboratory often fail to translate into population-level success? And what strategies can improve this translation? The trial lecture has been found satisfactory by the examination committee. So I would now like to ask the candidate to introduce her doctoral research in the form of a short lecture, and the opposing member of the examination committee to engage the candidate in a defense of the work. Should members of the audience wish to ask questions relating to the research, I ask you to bring this in written form to the attention of the chairperson, Linn, in break prior to the second opponent questions. Please, the floor is yours. Welcome up.
Thank you, Rector. Dear Evaluation Committee, thank you for allowing me to defend my thesis today. Dear colleagues, friends, family, thank you all for being here, listening and supporting me today. In ambulatory populations, we tend to get a lot of mechanical stimuli on the skeleton by the way of walking, running, jumping, doing resistance training, doing sports, and so on. And we tend to have relatively good bone mineral density, looking something like this. What we see here is trabeculi and these sort of plates, and we can see that it's relatively dense. We have small pores in the bone tissue, and we have relatively high density, meaning that it's strong and healthy and not at risk of fractures. However, in the wheelchair-using population, it might be a bit different. If you're not ambulatory, you will not sustain the same mechanical loading as walking because you're not walking, running, jumping. Your physical activity looks different and the mechanical stimuli is diminished. So the bone might look something like this. You can see the comparison that this is way less dense. We have breakage in the trabeculi and much larger pores. And this bone has lower density and is more at risk of fracture. This is a little bit of a busy slide, so don't worry about reading all of it. But the point here is that bone tissue, like any other tissue, is constantly remodeling and changing over time. So we have resorption or breakdown, and we have building up or formation of new bone on the other side. And this process continues all the time, and it's the equilibrium or the balance between the two processes that decides whether we have a net bone loss or a net bone formation, meaning that we're building bone or we're losing bone. This process takes weeks to months, and usually we can't detect new bone formation or loss in less than 3 months. We usually need 3 months to see it in X-rays. We can measure the processes by measuring surrogate markers for this active osteoclast, which is the bone breakdown cell, via this molecule called CTX1. On the other side, formation we can also measure in the blood as P1NP. The balance between the two is what will tell us whether it's going in the loss or formation direction. We did a study in Paralympic athletes before my PhD in collaboration with the Haan University in the Netherlands, where we had both ambulatory, which is the gray squares, and wheelchair-using para-athletes. And we measured bone mineral density with DEXA. So this is an X-ray machine that images the spine, the hip, and the whole body. And in the whole body and the spine, we saw that the bone mineral density was quite similar to a healthy population. So Z-score 0 equals to roughly the average in a healthy population. However, in the total hip and femoral neck, the average was lower, and no matter what area we looked at, we could see a huge variation with quite a few under -1, which means low bone mineral density, and under -2, which means osteoporosis. The prevalence of osteopenia, which is low bone mineral density, was 30 to 55% in the wheelchair users, while only 9 to 23 in the ambulant para-athletes. The ambulant para-athletes would be athletes with visual impairments, for instance. When we looked at the lumbar spine specifically, we saw that the sports that were typical team sports or sort of high-impact sports like tennis and basketball had significantly higher bone mineral density at the spine compared to paracycling, for instance. And what we thought of this was that these ball sports, both team and individual sports, have more multi-directional movement, have more impact, collisions, and so on, that gives mechanical stimuli to the lumbar spine. While cycling and alpine skiing and Nordic skiing are more one-dimensional movements, less impact or even no impact. And that might explain why these sports seem to have higher BMD at the lumbar spine. So sport isn't necessarily a protector of bone mineral density in para-athletes. We see low numbers for some, and especially at the hip and femoral neck. In an ambulatory population, we know that heavy resistance training works. We know that from these meta-analysis, this is just one example, but there's many, many of them. All of these are single studies, and the effect of each study, all of them are looking at resistance training, and the outcome is bone mineral density. Here, hip and lumbar spine. All of these lines is just showing the variability in the effect, but the meta-analysis is combining all the results and showing that heavy resistance training is favored for a positive outcome of the BMD. So both for hip and lumbar spine, we know that heavy resistance training works in ambulatory populations. So a female who might have a little bit of a low bone mineral density, maybe she's entered menopause and has been to a doctor who said that you need to start training, you need to start loading your skeleton. She can just go to the gym, start doing exercise, and she will likely have an effect. But we don't know how that works in wheelchair users because there's very, very few studies looking at this. So the overall aim of this thesis was to investigate the interplay in musculoskeletal adaptations to high-load resistance training in wheelchair-using people. The first aim of the thesis, which is also study 1 of the thesis and paper 1, was to compare bone mineral density at the lumbar spine and hip between those that are participating in sport, calling them sports active, comparing them to those that are not participating in sports, and also to explore impact loading activities and impairment characteristics and how they influence bone mineral density. The primary aim of the thesis and the first aim of study 2 and paper 2 was to investigate the effects of 24 weeks of high-load upper body resistance training combined with nutritional optimization on lumbar spine BMD and BTMs, which stands for bone turnover markers, the ones I showed you before, and comparing this to nutrition alone. The third and last aim, and paper 3 of the thesis, was to investigate the concurrent intervention effects on dynamic and isometric maximal strength and lean mass adaptations of this intervention. So the bone wheel study, which is the study that I've been part of, is actually one of the work packages of the ParaNut study mentioned earlier, which was a collaboration with the Han University and completed here in Norway, Oslo, and at the Han. One of the work packages in this was to actually do an intervention on bone health, which the bone wheel study is. This has been led from this institution, Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, where we had 3 work packages, 1 on bone health, 1 on physical health, and 1 on mental health. The 2 red ones are part of my thesis. The study was a multi-center randomized controlled trial, which we did here in Oslo, in Bergen, Western University of Applied Sciences in Bergen, NTNU, Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. So study 1, as mentioned under AIMS, was a cross-sectional study, and study 2 was a randomized controlled trial with the papers linked to it. The pink boxes are additional data that we do have, but which is not part of my PhD. So let's start at AIM 1 and paper 1. So it was to compare BMD at lumbar, spine, and hip between the sports active and non-active wheelchair users that we recruited, and to explore impact loading activities and impairment characteristics on BMD. So this paper is already published. We had 125 wheelchair users interested in partaking in the study. We scanned 68 of them, like we did here with this participant. In the DEXA scanner, we had 63 that we could analyze that were valid. And the criteria to partake was that they were 18 to 60 years old. We had both sexes, and wheelchair use was defined as more than 50% of the day or moving time. If they had an acquired impairment, meaning that they had an injury that led them to using a wheelchair, it had to be more than 2 years old to be stable. We only used the valid spine and hip scans, and we did not want, obviously, contraindications of DEXA scanning, such as being pregnant. What we found was a similar pattern to what we saw in the Paranut study, quite high absolute values here for whole body and lumbar spine, and the same here in the SED score, whole body right below the 0, which is average in the healthy population, age and gender matched, and lumbar spine a little bit lower, but still same sort of pattern, with hip and femoral neck being the ones mostly affected. Again, we see a large variation here, and we did see a significant difference between the lumbar spine and femoral neck and hip of 1.3 on the SED score scale. So what we can see is that the total body is roughly around the average of the healthy population. The spine is just below, and the hip is significantly lower at almost osteoporosis cutoff, 1.8, with the cutoff being -2. The prevalence of osteopenia and osteoporosis, or low bone mass and osteoporosis, was 37 and 47 at the hip, with low bone mass being 41 and 27. So roughly 75 to 80% had low bone mass or osteoporosis at the hip. That is 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5 wheelchair users. We had a relatively active group of wheelchair users recruited. 61% were physically active when we recruited them in varying degree. We had 17 different sports represented, which some did multiple sports and some did just one. Based on their main sport, we classified participants as sports active if they were performing organized sports for more than 1 year, or they were competitive in a non-organized sport. They had to train for more than 2 hours per week to be classified as sports active, and all others were non-sports active. These were the impairments that we had. SCI is spinal cord injury, CP cerebral palsy, SB spina bifida, and PPS is post-polio syndrome, and then we had some others as well, relatively equally distributed over the 2 categorizations. There was a little bit of a skew in gender distribution in the 2 categories, and obviously also a difference, no difference in a spinal cord independence measure, which measures how independent they are in mobility. But there was a difference a little bit in resistance training per week and obviously in training hours, which was one of the criteria. So what we saw was no difference. No significant difference in any of the sites measured: total body, lumbar spine, femoral neck, and total hip. No significant differences when we did an ANOVA of those two groups. But we do again see the large variation in both groups, and we had some significant covariates in the model, which was age and impairment characteristics, such as onset being acquired or congenital, full-time wheelchair users compared to those that did have some ambulatory ability, type of impairment, which was a categorization of 3, SEI, CP, and others, and then also the mobility score. But we did see a significantly lower prevalence of low bone mineral density at the hip in those that were categorized as sports active. The next thing we did was looking at impact, and we classified the sports that the participants were doing into high impact, low impact, or no impact for the spine, and for hip, femoral neck, we classified them as low impact or no impact. Again, we did not see any difference in either of the sites that we measured. This is just exemplified with the spine, but it looks the same for the hip. When we look at the different sports, such as we did in the Paranet study, we see kind of the same pattern here in the lumbar spine, that wheelchair tennis tends to be a little bit higher, but we did not do any statistics here because there's too few in the sample. So the conclusions from study 1 and paper 1 is that about 4 out of 5 wheelchair users have low bone mineral density and are at risk of fragility fractures. It might be independent of sports participation and degree of impact, but we do recognize that the classification has flaws. The most important thing seems to be the impairment characteristics and especially ambulatory ability. Okay, so study 2. This is the main study and the main aim of the thesis. Aim 2 and 3, covering paper 2 and 3. We wanted to investigate a 24-week-long high-load upper body resistance exercise program combined with nutrition optimization on specifically lumbar spine, but we measure the other markers as well that I've seen, showed femoral neck and hip and total body. In addition, we looked at bone turnover markers, maximal strength, and lean mass adaptations to this intervention. So in addition to the criteria I showed before, we also had criteria of non-progressive disorders. So we did not want impairments that were based in disorders that actually could progress over time. No contraindications for exercise. They would have to be able to do the exercises, and especially the key exercises had to be performed in a good manner, and no fractures in the last 6 months in the areas that we deemed important for either measurements or exercise. Again, we did not include those that were pregnant or those that had gotten into menopause. So from the 63 that we analyzed in the cross-sectional study, 52 was invited to the RCT and 45 enrolled in the RCT. The study design was again, multi-center randomized controlled trial where the intervention was high-load resistance training 3 times per week, and they could continue with their habitual activity, such as sports. And the control group continued with their habitual activity and no resistance training, unless that was what they were doing already. Everyone received a protein supplement 3 times per week of 30 grams protein with vitamin D and calcium included. After baseline, they were randomized into one of these 2 groups. They trained for 12 weeks, came back at T2 around week 12, 13, retested did another round of 12 weeks of training, and then tested at the end of the intervention. In addition to the protein supplement, everyone did 24-hour recalls, which informed on calcium intake, and together with the bone mineral density, they received extra calcium either to get up to 800 or 1,500 milligrams per day. For vitamin D, we measured in blood their vitamin D status, and we wanted them to be over 80 nanomoles. The clinical reference in Norway is 50, but we aimed for 80 and gave them supplements for that as well. The nutritional optimization, again, this was done in both groups, was largely successful. No differences between groups, which was what we wanted. Energy intake, or relative energy intake, was pretty stable throughout. Protein intake increased a little bit in both groups with the supplementation and came maybe a little bit back down, but relatively stable and high at over 1.4 and 1.2-ish grams per kilo. Vitamin D obviously increased with supplementation. Those that were over 80 at T2 did not get more supplements, so some of them did go back down at the end, but in general they were around 80, which was what we wanted. PTH is the marker that is kind of the reverse of vitamin D. If vitamin D is low, PTH is usually high, and we want it to be low. It's part of the bone metabolism cycle, so that's also an indicator of good vitamin D status, going down in both groups. Calcium shows a similar pattern to vitamin D. Obviously, with supplementation, the intake goes up, and again, a little bit down at the end. It might be something with the way we have measured. We can discuss that later. There was a significant difference in absolute intake, but when we standardized it to individual goals, being 800 or 1,500, there was no difference. The training intervention for especially the dynamic exercises, training volume can be seen here. On this side, it's the intensity in the green line in % of 1 RM. A familiarization period of 4 weeks was completed with supervised training before the participants went out and trained by themselves in their own environment in normal fitness centers, with 1 session per month back here for supervised sessions. We built up into a high intensity level right before a deload and testing at T2, and then rebuilt again and tapering down to T3. And we see the same here for reps, moving the other way, starting at higher number of reps and going down towards a higher intensity. So that is the study 2 design, and for the paper 2, where we looked at bone mineral density and bone markers, I just remind you of the CTX1 and P1NP and what they are markers for. And now the results. So for lumbar spine, we did not see any difference between the groups nor over time. For the femoral neck, we see a similar picture, although it can look like this is kind of going up and then back down. But in our models, there was no difference between groups or over time. For the total hip, similar, and also for total body less head, which is the whole body minus the head. Although this also looks like it's kind of going up a little bit at the end, but no significant effects. And then the blood markers. So CTX1 is the marker for resorption. we had a significant interaction term in the model, statistical model, which means that the difference between the differences, it's a little bit complex, but the difference here and the difference from 2 to 3 here are significantly different. And this is the training group in red. So the training group has a decline of resorption. So the breakdown of bone is reduced, is very simply put what this shows. The osteoblast on the other side, which is a marker for formation, is more flat here in the control group, goes up a little bit and then comes back down, but it's probably heavily influenced by some outliers here. It was not significant, it was only a trend of a difference at T2. But when we look at the ratio between the two, formation and resorption, there was again a significant difference between the differences from T2 to T3. Control going down and training group going up. Okay, so paper 3, where we looked at strength and lean mass. See if this one will play. Yeah, no sound. Okay. So this is one of the tests that we did, which was a maximal voluntary isometric contraction in the overhead press. And some other exercises that I'll show you soon, and also lean mass from DEXA from the whole body scan. So the first 2 exercises was the overhead press, where we thought that the isometric contraction would elicit a compressional force through the spine, potentially in loading the lumbar spine to give an effect, which we have seen that it didn't. But in strength of this exercise, we had a 16% increase over time in training compared to 6 in the control group. In the row exercise, where we, for those that had the ability, could do a sort of back extension type of contraction here, we saw a similar pattern, about 5% in the control and 12% in the training. When it came to the bench press, isometric bench press, it was no difference between the groups, around 15%, 14 and 15% increase over time. And in the supine pull, which is kind of a self-composed exercise, inspired by a mid-thigh pull, where they are laying flat on the ground with the feet up against something, pulling on a chain to again get that compressional forces from the foot all the way up to the neck. Again, here no difference between the groups. In the 1 repetition maximum, which was the dynamic tests we did, again overhead press, we did see a significant difference between groups, 2% in the control and 22% in training. And in the incline bench press, 1 RM, similar, -2 in the control and 17% in the training. What is interesting to catch is that we see most of this effect in the first half of the study between baseline and T2, and then more of a flattening in the second half. And we see this again here, or maybe an explanation of this, that the orange dots are the estimated volume that they should have performed on average in the exercise group. The blue line is a bit jagged, but that's because of a rolling average making it like that. But we can see that the volume performed and planned is sort of equal or above in the first half, and then in the second half, the planned is up here in the orange, and the performed is down here, which may explain what we see. When it comes to the body mass, it was very stable, maybe indicating a energy balance over time. Total lean mass was had a estimated adjusted difference of 700 grams, but was not significantly different between groups. For the upper body, only looking at the upper body lean mass, again, not significant, but a adjusted difference of 400 grams. And in the arms, it was significant just on P equals 0.05 of 300 grams in the arms. I haven't said that, but all of the figures are descriptive and not the model figures. So, in summary for study 2, we did not see any effect on bone mineral density. We did see some on CTX1, especially when we have calculated Cohen's d effect size, which is another measure. It's a standardization of the values. Something might be happening in the blood markers, but in general, very little. For strength, we do see large effect sizes, especially for overhead press, both the dynamic and the isometric. And for lean mass, there's also some effect, but only significant in the arms. So to summarize, we did have lower recruitment and higher dropout than what we wanted or presumed. We did have variable adherence also in both groups. We didn't see effect on BMD, but definitely on strength and some on lean mass and bone markers in the blood. There's lots of things to discuss, which I'm sure that we will. So to summarize for the thesis aims, in the first aim, we did not see differences between sports participation or impact levels. And the characteristics of the impairment seem to be the most important explanatory factor. And importantly, 4 out of 5 wheelchair users had low bone mineral density at the hip. For the primary aim, we did not see a change in BMD with this intervention, but maybe favorable changes in blood turnover markers. For the third aim, we did see a 12 to 22% increase in maximal strength in some of the exercises, and especially in the key exercises, and a small increase in arm lean mass. So the take-home is that high-load resistance training and nutrition optimization is tolerable for wheelchair users. It improves strengths and positively influences bone markers. I know that that's a little bit bold to say. However, the barriers to exercise selection and also quality of training may need to be further explored to enable measurable bone changes. I want to thank all partners and sponsors of the project. Too early to cry. All of these beautiful people have been part of the project, plus even more, I think. It's been a huge group effort. Thank you all for supporting me through the last 4 years. Thank you to my supervisors, Kristin, Truls, and Vegard. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Linn. And then I would ask the first opponent to come up.
I can get this to work.
Professor
is that
Greg
working?
Sates.
I go up?
Yes, please.
I need that, yeah.
You're supposed to stand over here.
Yeah.
So please.
Okay, well, hopefully you can hear me through this thing. Congratulations on getting to this point. I know it was a long process. It's not an easy process, so we're at the closing parts. So enjoy this bit. This is supposed to be enjoyed, and it should be enjoyable, and I'm sure it will be. So I guess where I'm going to start is, that was quite an undertaking. What motivated you to want to undertake a PhD in this particular area? Is it because you didn't want to get a job yet, or was it because you had some driving reason to do it?
How honest do you want the answer?
Honesty is always the best policy. At least that's what my mum tells me. So.
Well, I was going to be a dentist. My dad is a dental technician, and my dream was to be a dentist. That didn't happen. I fell into training and nutrition from being a handball player myself. Went into exercise science via my master and did my master project here at NIH with Truls as my supervisor. And during that time, I felt I need to do a PhD. This is what I want to do. So we actually collaborated on a grant proposal for a couple of years and a couple of rounds of application with that. And we didn't get funded. We were close, but didn't get funded. And this project kind of popped out of nowhere. I didn't know Kristin at the time. But it was kind of perfect with nutrition and bone and muscle or strength training intervention, all of the components of what I've been interested in over the years.
Good. So in another 20 years, you'll wish you'll have been a dentist.
Well, I've released that, but you can ask my dad later.
So that's great. So, you know, I like to see what the motivations are, because clearly that was a big undertaking, a multi-center trial. And we don't see too many multi-center trials as part of a PhD, actually. So perhaps just again, as a nice sort of easy, gentle opener, what were the challenges about undertaking a multi-center trial? Not just a multi-center trial, but a multi-center trial in a particular population, which probably also had its own challenges, and I'm sure Vicky will pick up some of that in her questions.
It's definitely been challenging. We didn't quite have the resources that we were hoping to in the beginning. So I think I've lost count of how many times I've been to each site, but I've been traveling the country, doing data collection, managing logistics and everything with help, but yes, it's been me running the show. So that has been very challenging. It's been time-consuming, but it's also been amazing, and I've learned so much from that process. But it's been challenging to run 3 sites as a PhD candidate with, not that much experience, especially not in a long 6-month intervention trial, randomized multi-center. So yeah, that has been challenging, but it's been good learning.
No, and congratulations on that. I've tried a few multi-center trials over the years, and I've never quite managed to pull one off really adequately yet. So well done on that.
I think we were a little bit lucky in that we had recruitment issues. We definitely did recruit best in Oslo. We had quite few participants in the other 2 sites, so it was a little bit more manageable on our end. And luck have it with the randomization, one of the centers didn't get anyone in the training group. So at least we didn't have to focus on going there to train anyone for 6 months. But we did have participants in one site extra with training participants.
So that was, I suppose, going to be one of my other questions, because one of the big problems quite often with a multi-center trial is trying to ensure standardization of measurements across the different sites. How did you view that, and how did you go about trying to ensure standardization with different bits of kit and different technicians and all of those kinds of challenges?
Well, one of the standardizations was me. I was the one doing most of the data collection, so that ensured some standardization, that I was the lead in all of the data collection. But we did have different DEXA machines in all 3 sites. It was 3 different models. So that was a challenge that we discussed at length, how to control for in the different analysis. And other standardizations that we did was, for instance, this bench that you could see in the pictures of the isometric exercises. I think there's 3 in the world of that bench, and we have 2. And we had 1 here and 1 that went back and forth between the 2 other sites. Mm-hmm. So the equipment is relatively standardized, although the DEXA machines are 3 different models.
Oh, yeah, very good. So in terms of the 3 different models then, how did you deal with that in terms of standardization of things like T-scores and Z-scores, which sometimes are based on slightly different databases?
Yes. So we did it differently in the two studies. In study 1, we obviously it was a cross-sectional study, so we wanted the data being standardized to one level so that we actually could compare. So what we did there was that we took all the data in absolute measures and corrected it with standardization correction equations to standardize it all to the level that we have here. And then we recalculated the SED scores based on the databases that or the reference material that we use here, so that it all was at the same level. In study 2, we did it statistically. Of course, when we have an intervention where we do repeated measures, we compare each single person from their own baseline to the next measurement. So, and we also controlled for the individuals, but also baseline levels in the models that we did statistics with, and we also controlled for site in those models.
Okay, good. So I've got a few general questions and a few specific questions. We might jump about a little bit, so hopefully we can keep track. But you use the term bone health quite a bit in your thesis.
Yeah.
What's bone health?
It can be several things. There's several things that we can measure to say something about bone health, but bone health is obviously quite broad of a term. In any health, we want to have the not have illness present, and it being functional and doing what it's supposed to do, and that it's not giving us any issues in our daily lives. But it can be measured in many different ways, and we are measuring a couple of them. So we measure bone mineral density, we measure some of the surrogate markers for bone metabolism, but we're not measuring fracture incidence, for instance, although we would have obviously reported that if that happened. But yeah, it can be other things involved in bone health than just the two things that we're measuring.
Yeah, that sort of passes
bone strength.
So that passes me on to my next question perfectly. You sort of mentioned about, and you measured bone mineral density or bone mass. Those terms are often used interchangeably. But of course, there's a bit of a distinct difference between bone mass and bone strength. And you mentioned that in the context of bone health relating to things like functionality and being able to withstand the skeleton being able to withstand the forces that we want to place on it to do what we want to do. So, and what's the difference between bone mass and bone strength?
Well, bone mass is just mass. It's what's there, and it can have different composition, and it can have different placement. When we look at bone mass in the whole body, for instance, we know that the skull is really dense, but it can be less dense other places. And whatever the density is, the strength is reliable on that on that total mass, but also the structure inside the bone, like we saw in the first pictures with the trabeculi, for instance, and how that gives stability and withstanding these forces that may lead to fragility fractures in some cases.
Yeah, so you kind of got three things that compose bone strength. You've got the total bone mass, the geometric distribution, and then the material properties of the bone. So it's kind of like, simply put, how much is there, where is it, and what's it made of, right? So then what do you think is the more important in terms of A, determining bone health, and then B, determining what the benefits of exercise to bone health, whatever that is, are? What do you think is most important, bone mineral density, bone mass, or bone strength?
For sure, strength. And bone mineral density is just one component of that strength, or bone mass is one component of that strength. Like you said, it's the the distribution in one bone, and also the geometry inside of it. But so strength is definitely the answer, which can be tested in different ways. Seeing how much force a bone can withstand before it breaks, for instance, but we don't do that to humans.
No, ethics committees do get a bit upset about that sort of thing. So I mean, I think that's quite interesting because, you know, you've got enough of a challenge in any population, specifically in the population that you've been measuring here, in terms of even determining bone mass, but determining bone strength would be very, very difficult. How do you think that's feasible in this population, or just not feasible at all?
I mean, it is feasible with different. I mean, we've used DEXA, which was what was available to us. There's other measuring tools that we can use. We can use CT, for instance. We can do a biopsy and really look at the bone structure. We have obviously software today that can give us some more detail of how the bone structure is on the inside, and not just looking at the total mass. And those things can indicate. So, for instance, looking at the width of the pores in the bone compared to trabeculi number, and so on and so on. There's many things that we could have done, but which was not available to us.
Yeah, very good, thank you. So, I'm going to move on and sort of ask you whether you know. So the results of your thesis collectively are quite interesting, and there's a number of different paradoxical results coming out of that to a certain extent. I'm first of all interested to see whether your perspective on bone physiology has changed as a result of your results, and I'll maybe come on to some specifics afterwards. But has the assumptions that you made going in, have you changed those at all?
Yes, for me personally, absolutely. I did not know very much about bone going into it, so I must admit that. The very, very basics. So yeah, definitely changed my view of, and we had these discussions actually from the very beginning, whether compressional forces, for instance, is enough to elicit a osteogenic stimuli, meaning being a great enough mechanical loading to produce bone changes, or whether it needs other things such as muscular pull from a muscle contraction, for instance. Yes, that has changed. And I think I've moved from thinking compressional forces may be enough to probably not.
So you know, maybe we could explore that a little bit more, and then come back to the interpretation of the results collectively. But so you're starting off very much from a mechanostat perspective, it seems, in the idea of the design behind your intervention, particularly. So you know, what do you think is the critical bit there between three key terms: the mechanostat leading into mechanotransduction, which leads into mechanosensitivity? Do you have a perspective?
Well, yes, agree that it was very much informed by the mechanostat theory of like just the compressional forces creating a stimuli of the osteocytes so that they would start increasing the bone removal or the formation process. However, the transduction, where you look more at also the fluids sort of moving inside the bone and the pressure coming from not just the compressional forces but the movement in the bone, is maybe where I think there's something to that. And then, sorry, what was the last one?
Mechanosensitivity,
yes.
And I think that comes back to yours, and we'll come on to this later on, but particularly interested in how you're defining impact activities in this,
yes.
in this population.
Yes. So, yeah, the sensitivity in terms of like, so I mentioned running before as an example of, you think that when you run you have a lot of forces and a lot of impact on the skeleton, but when you do that continuously and a lot, you will stop sort of being sensitive to that stimulus, and it won't be osteogenic anymore, or you won't adapt to it. And it's kind of similar in all types of training. I think people can relate that if you do the same loading of your bench press over time, your body will stop responding to it. It's kind of in that realm, that you need a stimulus that is new and exciting for the bone to respond.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I mean, I think that's one of the things, isn't it? It's quite interesting that, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on where your population of interest here in your thesis sits within this, because traditionally what we normally see is anything that's high impact, high intensity, particularly multi-directional movement around a joint, and you know, intermittent in nature. That's probably the most stimulus you're going to get to bone.
Yeah.
And some of that is possible in your population with the approach that you've taken. Some of that isn't. What discussions did you have up front in the design of your intervention about to what extent you could get each of those properties into your design?
We did discuss it, both just in our research group, but we also did some piloting, and we tested out what was feasible to actually complete, like how they could actually perform it. So we did discuss, for instance, multidirectionality. We talked about more sort of rotational forces of the spine, which is included, but very few of the participants were able to do it, so I didn't show it, but sort of like a seated cable row with more of an explosive movement, as well as ball throws and stuff like that to create like great forces, high speeds, and multidirectionality. However, that seemed to be quite hard to perform, and as I said, the cable rotation that we actually did include in the program was just a few that could perform at all. So therefore, we went the other way with more sort of traditional heavy strength training of both dynamic and isometric exercises to at least ensure a high load, and also time under tension to kind of give that, make sure that the mechanical stimuli was the greatest that we were able to get in a safe way with exercises that most of them could perform.
Great. We'll probably come on to that again a little bit more, unpick some of that. But just moving on in terms of how, you know, you came up with the design for the intervention. Did you ever think about, was it always going to be an exercise intervention? Or did you sort of think, oh, hang on a minute, what about something like, I don't know, vibration, for example, where we might be able to, you know, take a more whole body approach to the stimulus?
We did not consider including any type of additional things like vibration therapy or functional electrical stimuli or anything like that, because we thought that would take away from feasibility and applicability and scalability. So we wanted to take those studies that we have seen with, for instance, resistance training with functional electrical stimuli, which is quite common in rehab settings, especially with spinal cord injured patients, and try to make it as pragmatic as possible for them to be able to do it on their own in a gym setting and not in a clinic setting. So yeah, we never thought of doing any of those kind of things. It was traditional strength training, which was always the plan.
So you usually leave this question to closer to the end, but would you rethink that now, given the results that you've got? Would you rethink that now as an alternative or as an addition, potentially?
A potential addition. I think maybe there is something to neuromuscular stimuli or functional electrical stimuli, maybe together with strength training, perhaps. But yeah, the results are still a little bit all over the place, and again, I don't think it's very pragmatic. Yes, a lot of wheelchair users will have contact with the healthcare system through like physiotherapy, for instance, so that it can be a component, perhaps. But yeah, I don't think it's going back to what we talked about earlier today, or what I presented earlier today. I don't see that's very pragmatic and feasible for people to do over time.
Good. Yeah. So let's go on to the results then. I'm thinking more now collectively, because you've got some results there of an association study, and then you've got the results of an intervention, and you've got some bone changes, and you've got some muscle changes, and you've got some bone metabolism changes. And they all seem to go in sort of somewhat slightly different directions and tell a slightly different story across the population. So how do you, and this is a horrible question, so I apologise in some ways, but how do you build those results together collectively as an overall, because you present them very coherently, but overall, what do you think that means? Because you've got some things that go up, some things that go down, some things that don't change.
I mean, when we measure strength, we measure it in exercises that we hoped would have an impact on especially the lumbar spine. We didn't have a hypothesis that it would change much at the hip. We thought that's a bonus if that happens, but we don't think we can kind of hit that spot with what we are able to do with these exercises, or the selection of exercises that we can use. But we did hope that it would have an effect on the lumbar spine. Also, a little bit with the thinking that the compressional forces that you can create, especially with the isometric overhead press, where you can really get a good loading. But yeah, we thought that would work. But when that doesn't, and we see an increase in strength, some increase in lean mass in the arms, and maybe something in the blood markers, in the bone turnover markers, I think that we maybe should have measured BMD changes in the arms, for instance. That could have maybe given us some insight to whether that's what we've changed, and maybe the bone markers in the blood comes from that. Obviously, that's systemic. The blood markers go into the blood and is everywhere, but where they come from, we don't really know. So I maybe regret that a little bit, that we didn't measure in the arms, in the radius, for instance.
Yeah, interesting. So one of the things that I found quite interesting about results, to a certain extent, is I think it's probably almost one of the most important bits, is that there was a divergence there between the muscle and the bone responses to a certain extent. Okay, the muscle strength changed largely in the upper extremities, I think I'm right in saying. And then you got some bone responses that didn't really change. We'll come on to bone metabolism in a minute, that's a bit different. But, that's again, somewhat challenges the assumption that improvements in muscle strength will result in improvements in the bone. So how do you think that there are implications for that finding in terms of that prior assumption? Do you think it's a population-specific assumption, or actually should we challenge the fact that maybe muscle strength isn't as important for bone as we think it is?
I do think that muscle strength is important. Because muscle strength will also, or if you're stronger, you can have a greater load when you train, and I think that's important to elicit changes in the bone. However, what we see with the increase in strength and a little bit in muscle mass and nothing in the bone, I don't see that as very surprising, because we are measuring bone at completely different places to where we see the changes in muscle and strength. I mean, the muscle mass is increasing in the arms. The strength is mostly in this pressing position, somewhat in the row, but it's in the upper body and the upper extremities. we are measuring lumbar spine at the very bottom towards the pelvis and in the pelvis, which is not connected to the arms. And
good anatomy knowledge.
And we have a population which, if I remember correctly, around 40% is spinal cord injured, with an injury somewhere on their spine, disconnecting also maybe even the lumbar spine, but especially the hip, from those muscles working in these exercises. So I'm not so surprised.
Good answer. What do you think, or did you think about? Well, let me compose a question in your head, Craig, first. So we hear a lot about muscle and bone crosstalk.
Yeah.
And of course, that would be quite interested also in this population, because you are moving muscle mass as regards to the training that you've intervened with. But there's potentially some competing signals there, upper extremities to lower extremities, and certainly in some of your participants. Did you ever sort of think about whether there might be some interesting, biochemical or molecular analysis that you could have performed on your?
Yes, many. It would have been interesting to look at more sort of muscle signals, looking at IGF-1, for instance, looking into more of those markers that might be competing. I must say I'm not completely into all of those, but there's markers that will kind of be part of both processes and could be potentially maybe explanatory of why we see in one place and not in the other. But again, yeah, I think I've become a skeptic of my own results or my own intervention.
Right, and that's great. That's the point of a PhD. So that's not. Don't panic. That's not a problem. So that's a good thing. So I mean, I think it'd be quite an interesting sort of model there in some respects, because you kind of almost got two competing signals at the same time. You've got almost like a disuse signal, and you've also got a use signal. So I think just something that struck me
especially with the spinal cord injured part of the cohort. We know that hormones change. We know that the hormones change a lot in many ways, like testosterone goes down. All of these signals that you're talking about, like IGF-1 and the thyroid hormones and everything, can change quite a bit and also be very variable, but it can change quite a lot with a spinal cord injury, which would potentially be detrimental to even improving muscle mass.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. So I'm going to jump back a little bit, because there's some things about the population. So I'm right in thinking that so the natural consequence of a low bone mineral density is, and the major clinical problem with that is fracture, a fragility fracture or an osteoporotic fracture, however you want to describe it. And I'm right in thinking you didn't see any of
fractures?
Your population with fracture.
Sorry.
None of your population ended up with fractures.
We had one fracture, but that was a training accident. Okay. So he had about 120 kilos fall into his chest and crack his rib. So yeah, that was.
But that would do it.
That would do it. Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering, because you presented some data, I think, somewhere in your introductory narrative about very high rates of fragility fracture in this population, and I'm kind of wondering, what are the sites of those fragility fractures? And the other question would be, is the age of those fragility fractures different in this population compared to the wider general population?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to show that here, but we know that when we go through puberty, we grow and we increase our bone mass over time. We come up to sort of 25, 30 years old. We have a peak bone mass, and then it kind of stays there a little bit, and then it starts slowly declining as we age. And it's usually especially women and old age as risk factors for osteoporotic fractures or fragility fractures in ambulatory populations, especially the kind of women 60-plus-ish. But in this population, fragility fractures are more common in much, much younger. And also in our cohort, there was report of fractures, historic fractures, which would tend to be in the bottom half of the body, in the lower extremities, especially from knee down. Some would also have wrist fractures and stuff, but it's most common, and we know that the most common clinical sites to have fractures is tibia, for instance.
Yeah, interesting.
And at an earlier or younger age.
So at a younger age.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's quite significant. So one of the other things I was looking at, and a statement that jumped out to me from your narrative was, I think you said, I'm quite interested in this statement, that the biggest responses to an exercise training intervention, and I'm reading it off of here, so, were in those individuals with the lowest starting BMD.
Yes.
So I'm kind of wondering where that evidence base came from. And then from there, what factors do you think may influence or affect that observation? Because I haven't always necessarily seen that, not specifically, obviously, in your population, but...
So those that have the lowest starting point, having a low BMD at the beginning, before an exercise intervention, may give more room to have an increase, while those that have a normal BMD might not change as much, was the statement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the question was?
So I was wondering whether that was just something that you came up with theoretically, or whether that was something you have an evidence base to support. Based off just my own sort of studies, I haven't really necessarily noticed that association. I understand what you're saying in terms of, you know, maybe there's a bigger range to move into.
Yeah.
But
can we get the screen? So we did see. I mean, we have a small cohort, and I mean, it's not a huge. Well, it is relatively okay. It's a significant association between the baseline lumbar BMD and the change. So here it's actually when you have a higher, so it's the same as you were saying, when you have a higher starting point, you don't see the same amount of change. Here it's actually a negative change, and here is a positive change. So if you're starting lower at the BMD of the spine, you have a little bit of a higher, but this is very few data, and it's in my supplementals. It's not, I don't know how much I can rely on this few data points, but it is significant. And I'm also sure that there's another study showing this that had a bigger population that saw that those that had a low starting point did have greater change with exercise.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember the citation, though.
No, that's fine. I'll go back and check some of my own data. It's good. So let's get back into some of the results. I'm quite interested in your description of the bone markers, and particularly in your description of the bone turnover markers. So what do you think those bone markers are showing? What the different bone markers are showing?
So the CTX1, as far as I've understood, is a so it's a collagen that is released when the bone is breaking down by the osteoclasts, which is a indication of activity of the active osteoclast. While P1NP is a marker, again, it's a large molecule which is released when the precursor of the osteoblast activate into the osteoblast. As far as I understood, I know that I know this at a quite basic level. So these two markers show activity in these cells that are doing the bone breakdown or the resorption and formation. And each single marker isn't necessarily so informative, but seeing them together and seeing the balance between them and how that balance perhaps shifts could indicate something. However, the CTX1, for instance, is, or both markers can also indicate activity in other tissue than just bone. For instance, in connective tissue. So it isn't a clear-cut, this increases or decreases, and that means that bone is changing. But it potentially could be, as far as I've understood.
Yeah, okay, so what's bone turnover?
Turnover is the changing of tissue, so both processes, formation and resorption, and shifting out bone tissue.
So but that's a linked process.
Yes, both things are happening.
So do you think you can get to a situation, and this sort of speaks into your ratio that you use between CTX and P1NP, do you think you can get to a situation where you can make implications and inferences about bone turnover from circulating markers of CTX and P1NP?
Let me think. So, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so bone turnover is a linked process.
Yep.
In terms of what you're talking about, within a bone modeling unit or remodeling unit. And you've got two markers that you're measuring in a blood sample. Mm-hmm. So can you get an inference on turnover from a systemic measurement of those two markers?
Well,
do you think you're actually measuring turnover is what I'm
no. No, I see where you're going. Of course, when you're measuring something in blood that is systemic, you have no way of knowing where that's coming from. I guess no. The answer is no.
So you're kind of only getting an overall picture. So being ridiculous about it, your changes in CTX that are coming into your circulation could come from here.
Yep.
And your changes in P1 and MP could come from down here.
Yes.
And you might measure changes in the bone, but then to say that's a linked process in terms of an increase in resorption and a decrease in formation, or vice versa, at a specific bone is not
possible.
It's not possible. So we've kind of shifted a little bit away from calling them bone turnover markers now. I'm not quite sure what you call them, but we've just gone to markers of bone resorption and formation. But even that's not particularly accurate because, as you rightly say, things like particularly P1NP is more of a type 1 collagen synthesis marker, not really a bone-specific marker anymore. So, someone like Keith Barr, for example, uses this as a measurement of collagen synthesis in tendon and ligament, not in
exactly,
bone.
yeah.
So it's a little bit difficult. So I'm also interested in how you would like, maybe you interpreted it, because I think you said some positive changes in the bone turnover balance.
Potentially.
She's already changed her mind, right? So when CTX goes down in your, I think in your data, CTX went down, and P1NP went up a little bit. So that would traditionally indicate breakdown's going down, formation's going up. What makes that positive?
Well, in that very simplistic way of interpreting it is that if we have less breakdown and more formation, hopefully net you will have an increase in bone mass over time. But I'm aware that's extremely simplistic, especially in terms of what we just discussed. But yeah, that's how I've viewed it.
So what about that in the context of remodeling the bone? Because if you're... So the other way of interpreting that, and I've wrestled with this for years, so you're not alone, is when the CTX goes down, you're actually reducing the breakdown of old, damaged bone.
Yep.
So if you're reducing that breakdown, you're actually accumulating weakened bone, which is a bad thing, not a good thing.
Especially for bone strength, yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, these bone markers are inherently very, very difficult to interpret.
Yep.
I mean, it's not that you've necessarily interpreted them wrong, it's just that there's so many different ways to interpret it. I mean, I also right in thinking that you measured bone alkaline phosphatase as well.
Yes.
Which is quite interesting, because bone alkaline phosphatase is more a marker of later stage mineralization of the bone, which is, you know, in terms of the length of your intervention, you might have expected to start to see something. And of course, one of the benefits there is that is bone specific, at least. But I'm right in thinking you didn't see changes in bone alkaline phosphatase?
No.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Interesting that you didn't see that, but again, you know, some of this thing might be time frame dependent as well. So.
Yeah, and I mean, we did discuss these markers and whether they were good markers, and we brought them along in the process. CTX1, for instance, we know that is very much variable throughout 24 hours. We did what we could to control for time of day and all of those kind of things, preparations, fasting, all of those kind of things. So we know that the changes that we see should be because of the intervention, and there is a significant difference in the change between the groups. So something is happening, but whether that is tendon or bone, obviously we don't actually know. Or whether it's in the arms and not in the spine, we don't know. Yeah,
I mean, I think it was, certainly sensible enough to measure them. It just shows how difficult it is sometimes to interpret. Bone is a very difficult tissue to interpret. We've talked about, in the same way as bone mineral density is specific, then you've got different sites, then you've got measurement of microarchitecture, then you've got turnover, metabolism, all of these sorts of things. It's very difficult tissue to really get to a clear picture on, which is always problematic. But I think it was sensible to measure them, certainly. It's just, I think we have to be more and more careful over interpretation, I think. And we mentioned time frame briefly, which brings me on to, again, another just design element of the intervention. Where did sort of 24 weeks come from? Where did 3 times a week come from? Where did, I think your intensity was 75 to 95%, something like that, which is a decent range. Where did those decisions come from? Was it a finger in the wind, or was it based upon some...
First of all, we obviously didn't have anything to compare to in this population. So we didn't know exactly how long we would need to see structural changes in BMD, but we do know that it is possible to see changes with strength training in ambulatory populations in 12 weeks of maybe a couple percent to 3-4%. So we did think that we would need maybe twice as long, because we assumed that the loading and stimulus that we could create in this population with this intervention wouldn't necessarily give, or would be lower than what we are able to do in ambulatory, and therefore maybe needed longer to see the same magnitude of change. So 24 weeks comes from literally doubling the time of what is possible to see changes in ambulatory. 3 times per week comes from knowing that frequency of stimulus is relatively important. There's literature showing that 3 sessions a week is better than 2. So that's what we went.
But is 4 better than 3?
No. But 3 is better than 2, so that's why we went with 3.
Good.
Was there another factor you mentioned?
Just the intensity, I think.
Yeah, intensity. we thought it was very important to have that time in the beginning, the first 4 weeks, because they were going to train by themselves. We thought it was very important to start very slow on the intensity so that we could have focus on other things like teaching them how to train in technique, obviously, but also just like some of them had never been to a normal gym or fitness center, moving around the center, how to be independent from a wheelchair in a normal gym setting without any adapted equipment, how to find different solutions to the different exercises and so on, was very important for the first 4 weeks. So we didn't focus on intensity in the beginning, but more sort of getting them primed to do training. We obviously did increase a little bit in that time as well. And those that had experience with training were allowed to have a little bit higher than 75-ish, I think was the lowest. Yeah, and then moving them out into normal gyms, we wanted to relatively quickly get them up. So they had, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks of like moderate intensity and then coming up to high relatively quickly.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Thanks for that. So it's good to see that there's
it was very much pragmatic.
A plan and a pragmatic plan. And that might, I've got a follow-on question there that might be the same reason. It's, because I think you said it in your own presentation, your age range was quite wide. And you also had quite a wide range of male participants and female participants, and I think there was a difference there. So, of course, the part of the potential issue there is, of course, that there are lots of different stages of bone development between an 18-year-old and a 60-year-old, particularly then also in a female participant. And you said you excluded menopausal participants. So what was the reason for the wide range? I'm assuming it was just to get enough participants, but I'm assuming that's quite a simple answer.
Yeah, definitely a recruitment thing, but also at least in ambulatory, there's good effect of resistance training also in elderly, so we didn't see a reason to cap it to more than 60 or downwards more than 60, except for those that had hit menopause. So in reality, I think the oldest participant was 53 or something, and that was a man, and for females it was maybe 50 in reality. But yeah, we could have potentially had some 60-year-olds, male participants likely, and we thought at the time that it wouldn't matter too much in the magnitude of change possible, whether you're maybe 18 male would be, the rate might have been higher than a 60-year-old, but because we're also measuring over time in or repeated measures in the same participant and comparing to their own baseline, we also didn't think that would be such a problem, but I know where you're going because it's creating variability and heterogeneity.
Well, yeah, it is, but also coming back to your other point about responsiveness to intervention, do we know in the same way that maybe someone with a low pre-existing body mass would have a bigger scope for intervention? Would that not necessarily be the case that someone is positively turning over bone versus someone that's negatively turning over bone? Might there be a difference there in what you might expect to see in terms of response to intervention?
Did you mean now? Sorry, I'm trying to focus. Did you mean if they are changing their body mass and whether that would impact?
Well, if you take an 18-year-old who's still potentially laying down some bone mass, but you take a 45, 50-year-old who's at the very least stable, if not, unfortunately for me, going into some sort of age-related bone decline. And particularly if you, for example, got a perimenopausal female within that age range who's losing probably about, I don't know, 10, 15, 20% of mass across a 2-year transitional period, what would your response to intervention be? Would you expect the response to intervention to be an exercise intervention to be the same in those participants with those characteristics?
No, my instinct is that no. I mean, obviously, if you're in a period of bone life where you're still in a net formation, like an 18-year-old man who's still in puberty, basically, and still creating bone mass, then that would potentially look like an increase, which don't necessarily, or wouldn't necessarily be because of the exercise intervention. And similarly, on the other side, that if you're losing mass because of perimenopause, could kind of equal out that change in the other one, basically creating a net zero where the average would be no change. Yes.
It's a conceptual point because obviously, you know, to a certain extent, he had no choice but to do this to try to get enough participants. And as it worked out, you probably haven't got too many problems on that front because of how it's worked out. But it's just, you know, I think we do have to be careful about those very wide ranges quite often as well. I'm looking at, have I got much time left?
4 minutes.
4 minutes, right. Let's go on some. So I'm interested in figure 2 on page 181 of your thesis.
181?
181. Let me see. I need to find it myself.
181.
181. Well, that's on the PDF version that I've got.
Okay. Is it from paper 2?
I think it's 1. I'm not sure. Let me get
Paper
there.
1. Is it this figure here, maybe?
I think you did also show it in your. It's figure 2. It's where you've got the BMDZ scores of the total body, the lumbar spine,
This
the
one?
femoral neck, and the hip. No, it's that
No.
one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that one do. So I found this quite interesting in some respects. So, you know, you've got BMDs there, and you've identified those Z scores where there's indications of a poorer bone health and indications where there's positive bone health. But if you look in a lot of those, there's a few participants that are right down in the red. But there are a few participants that are pretty well up in the green. My first question is, are those participants that are in the green for total body also the same ones that are in the green for lumbar, hip, and femoral neck, or are they different participants? And the same for the reds. Are they the same individual participants or different individual participants?
Yep. I think I'll show the one I thought you meant anyways, if that's okay. Because it kind of illustrates the sort of dissociation between BMD at hip and spine. So here we see, this is a scatter plot of the same individual for femoral neck versus the lumbar spine here. And you see a dissociation between the two sites, the BMD in the two sites, especially for those that are full-time wheelchair users. In the femoral neck and lumbar spine, it's just like all over the place for especially the full-time wheelchair users. And if you look at this one here, obviously femoral neck and total hip is very closely linked, obviously because it's in the same region, but we did see a little bit more cohesiveness in the part-time wheelchair users. If we had put a line through here in the blue markers, that would have been a relatively, I haven't run the numbers with me today, but that would be a significant.
We still can't see the individual participants on there, though, which is the
on
bit
the level
I'm getting to. Yeah, because I
so
think,
I'll go back to this one.
Yeah, because I guess what I'm asking is, so almost like these are quite interesting participants to me. So if these people are the same people, for example, but these people are the same people, then you've got somebody who's actually got pretty good bone across all sites, or pretty poor bone across all sites.
So obviously there's very few in the hip and femoral neck in the green area and very many in the other two. So it's not quite the same, but for the femoral neck and hip, it's the same individuals.
Yeah, we'll take the top two. I'm wondering if you could pick out characteristics of individuals who are high versus individuals who are low.
Yeah.
And is there something that explains why the high ones are high and why the low ones are low?
So for femoral neck and hip, those that are high tend to have ambulatory ability, but not always. So you see, you see the full-time wheelchair users are the triangles. So there are some triangles also in the green area, but more often than not, those that are lowest in femoral neck and hip are those with spinal cord injury. And in the spine, it was actually reverse. It was actually those with a congenital impairment that had the lowest BMD at the spine. So actually the opposite. So congenital is those that are born with their impairment, often CP in this cohort, and vice versa for the hip, where spinal cord injured, who tend to have the least amount of ambulatory ability and also have hormonal changes and everything, be higher at the hip, higher at the spine and lower at the hip compared to CP.
So it might be quite interesting if you just, for example, redrew that figure, but with the participant numbers there, so you could see where they sit across it. And I think maybe trying to pull out some of those characteristics between the 2 or 3 that are really high and the 2 or 3 that are really low. I don't know. Might be informative. Might not. But, so I guess I'm pretty much close to my last question. I know Vicky's probably going to ask some sort of nice finishing questions, so I'm going to go to another data one, because I'm quite interested in how you defined, I think it's on figure, it's a supplementary figure 2. It's relating to the high impact activity differences. And I'm quite interested in how you define high impact in this case, because is it high impact to the skeleton, or is it just... So what is high impact in this context, I guess?
Yeah. So I'll just go back to this one. So what we did was... so we have called it high impact and low impact and no impact, which is very bombastic. And it's definitely not a quantitative way of categorizing these sports. We have literally done a visual inspection of the movements in that sport and whether we think that the impact moments or the if it has multi-directional movements, if it's a more explosive type of activity, whether it contains collisions between players and stuff like that, we have called it high impact, potentially with an impact on the spine or a osteogenic stimulus on the spine. And we literally looked visually at the different sports and tried to sort of see where the forces was moving in the different movements that they were doing in their sports.
So I'm just also wondering whether you could, thinking about sort of like the mechanic sensitivity angle, whether you could almost split those into longer-term continuous activity versus broken up muscular activity. That might be another interesting separation. But yeah, good. Don't know if I have one more question, or am I out of time?
I think
I'm out of time. Well done. I'll ask you that question later.
Okay. Thank you.
So, thanks to both of you for polite and academic discussion. I will take 15 minutes break and meet back here 10 to 3. Thank you. important person, Linn. Yeah, yes. Well, welcome back. Welcome back. So now we're looking forward to listen to the dialogue between the second opponent, Professor Victoria Tolfrey from Loughborough University, and Linn. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess how do I follow that, really? I mean, you've done a fantastic job for the first half of your public defence, so very well done so far. And it was a wonderful PhD to read, so I'd like to thank the examiners, in terms of the supervisors, rather, to get the examiners, such as myself, up here. So, yes, much commended study that I'd like to congratulate. So you'll be pleased to know that I'm not the bone expert. And there are a couple of questions that Craig has set up, which I'd perhaps like to just tease out a little bit more. And I guess where I come from is more, just for the audience, I guess, who may not know who I am actually, is that I come from Paralympic sport, and I use the Paralympic journey around optimising performance through to rehabilitation. So I think what you've done is a really fantastic study for me to take away, actually, to be thinking about how do I get people into physical activity in the first place. I think you've provided a wonderful environment for people to go independently into a gymnasium, into a gym to do the S&C, strength and conditioning work. I would like to touch upon what perhaps Craig got to, and there's two perhaps angles here. One is in terms of your heterogeneous population group, which I'll discuss in a moment. But ultimately what I'd like to... I was going to start with it, but how you answered Craig's question, I'm going to actually perhaps end with it, but I'm going to give you a preamble now so you know what I'm going to end in the next 50 minutes, is if you had the money and the resources, not just yourself coordinating, I'd like to really know what your ideal next study would actually be. I thought that you were perhaps going to go down the functional electrical stimulation, neuromuscular electrical stimulation route, but I get the impression that that might not be the angle that you'd want to go down. I'd like to sort of tease that out towards the end of the discussion. But to start with, I read in your PhD, and apologies, I've got random notes in front of me. I'd like to almost just sort of just re-go back to the definition of what you describe as a wheelchair user. Again, there's cultural differences in terms of how we define it. I noticed that you didn't actually use the term which we read in the Dutch literature, a manual wheelchair user. So I'd be interested to know whether any of your participants were electric wheelchair users. And I'd like to build out the conversation of your ambulant and your sort of your daily wheelchair users, but more actually with the health conditions, the impairment types. So I read that you say that you defined your wheelchair users who rely on a wheelchair for plus 50% of their mobility. So does that mean that you would exclude someone who uses a wheelchair for 48% of their mobility? And just where did you get that cut off?
Yeah, great question. Again, this is has been completed in a very much pragmatic way. We thought that one way of... is this on? Yeah. One way to... Ikke på? Jo, sier noen. Den på. Sånn. Der. One way to ensure that the population was somewhat homogeneous was to ensure that we included those that, for the most part, used a wheelchair for their mobility. So not those that used it if they were going to travel a lot or go to a concert, then they would bring a wheelchair, but in everyday life, using the wheelchair for more than 50%, based on their subjective estimate. Yeah. So that was how we defined that. Was there a second part?
Or did any use like an e-assist, or were they electrical
Oh,
in
yes.
use? When...
Yeah, so it's deliberate that I'm not saying manual wheelchair users, because there were some that used electric wheelchairs, and also some that had multiple ones using both, depending on the context or what they were doing. Some that had motorized manual ones. So yeah, that's why I haven't said specifically manual wheelchair users.
Yeah, and just
but
in the
most of them were.
Okay, and just in the latter discussion that you had with Craig, you actually brought up some slides that then had the term part-time and full-time. So how does that operate in that definition of that 50%? How did you then determine they were part-time or they were full-time?
Yeah, so we've defined full-time as those that did not have ambulation or didn't have any standing and ambulatory ability. Or even if they did, it was so minimal that for all their mobility purposes, unless it was for just kind of standing with support, for instance, they were using a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And then again, by their own estimates.
Okay, yeah. So what you perhaps highlighted there is quite interesting in terms of standing with their own support. So I think, Craig, and yourself, you've had some discussion around that wide age range of 18 to 60 years of age. And I think I note in one of your tables that obviously you got some descriptors around the participant pool. But one thing I don't think I saw, whether or not it's maybe written in your text, is time since injury. And I'm just wondering, or if I have, then please just, you can share me the slide and talk me through it. But obviously you got to some discussion, I think, where you said that you had females that were 50 and your males were 53 years of age. But do you not feel that some of the parameters around bone health, and I'm not the expert in bone, but bone health, could be, there's a covariate there in terms of time since injury, particularly those individuals who may have a road traffic accident when they're 40, but then they've become a manual wheelchair user. So do you think that you could have interpreted some of your data set by thinking, do you know what, these are people that have had a very long term. So you looked at it in ambulant versus non-ambulant, really, in your definition, but do you want to have a discussion around that time since injury? Or did you have that as a covariate or something?
Yeah. Absolutely. We had the categories of acquired congenital that we looked at. We had time since injury not time since injury per se, but we did have since injury, but we also did have for how many years that they had been a wheelchair user for more than 50% of the time, because in a lot of the congenital impairments, they might not use a wheelchair for the first 15 years of their lives, and then they start using the wheelchair. So we had both. And we looked at those covariates in our modeling, but did not find that they were retained when we did the modeling.
Yeah. So just let's go to rehabilitation practice. I'm just trying to get an understanding of the Norwegian sort of rehab care, because this is the population cohort that you're then trying to improve bone health. And certainly in the UK, for the first maybe 6 months of spinal cord injury rehabilitation, we will encourage our participants to do sit-stand.
Yep.
In the idea of they want to be leaving with some, whether or not we know the time course of what's happening here. But could you just talk me through maybe a typical 12 months, from your knowledge, of rehabilitation in Norway, of someone who has got paraplegia?
Yeah. In the spinal cord units, they will, of course, do a lot of exercise and physical therapy and occupational therapy and so on. And bone health is one of very, as you know, many things that they have to focus on to ensure that they are rehabilitated as best possible to be independent and go back to their daily living as independent as possible. From my knowledge and from accounts from participants, bone health is the least talked about. And they do measure it usually, especially in Sunnaas. I know that they measure patients, but it might have changed in the recent years. I haven't been there for a while. Before cerebral palsy, for instance, it's never talked about. So for the general wheelchair user, it's usually not talked about. That's what the participants have been telling me, that they didn't really think about it. They didn't know about it. But in a rehabilitation setting, they will do standing therapy, for instance, standing in one of these preacher chairs and with harnesses and stuff like that, absolutely, to, of course, mobilize and get blood flow and get a stretch of the spine and all of those things, and but also to get that gravitational forces to try to stimulate some of what they can, but also functional electrical stimuli to try to preserve some of the muscle mass.
Yeah. So I guess there I'm just touching upon something you discussed this morning around the sort of co-production, co-creation side of things. That is, if people are going through some form of rehabilitation and I guess there's some educational package in place from a clinician, a practitioner around the importance of exercises for X, Y, and Z, then it may be something that then can get taken out into the local community. But coming on eventually to that last question in terms of what your ideal study would be, in terms of the economy and the health benefits of just general worsening of health because of the nature of the impairment, etc. And maybe I'm focusing a bit more on spinal cord. I'll come to cerebral palsy in a moment. But obviously we have pressure ulcers, and we also have the bone health side of things. What's the prevalence of you may have had it in your background, I can't remember now, but why did you go straight into bone rather than other health indices? Because there's so many of us, that spiral of sort of health as a result of a spinal cord injury. Why did you go in with the bone health side of things?
Well, it was predefined. That was the project was predefined before I came into it. As part of the Paranat study from the Netherlands, but also as part of the grant that gave me my role in the project. So that bone health aspect was something that was defined, as far as I know, from the Netherlands.
Would you challenge it based on, public health that you know today in this population? Or I guess it's still teasing you to that question of what your next study would be, but is it something that you would continue because you feel that there are some benefits if we get the protocol, the adherence right, etc., or do you feel there'd be another health concern in this population that you'd look to try to understand more about?
Today, I probably wouldn't have had. Well, I think the bone health is really important. I think it is a huge issue with all the fractures that we see in this population. But I don't know if exercise is the remedy in this population.
Okay.
I am cautiously optimistic that with certain things in place that maybe we could have seen something, but I think that there's other health aspects that could be more important. With that said, I think that strength training and resistance exercise in this population is really important. So I think the mode is really important, but if it's important for that outcome, I'm not quite sure.
Okay, So with your design that you did in the main study, obviously, again, going back to this co-production, I sort of love the fact that we're bringing people into the discussion to help you with the design. And I think you wrote in your methods that you came up with the sort of longitudinal strength and conditioning program with consultation with individuals with cerebral palsy, individuals with spinal cord injury. If we look at those two specific health conditions, then you came to a generic protocol, but yet we do know that there's maybe more fatigue in someone with cerebral palsy versus someone with spinal cord injury. You've got someone who's a tetraplegic versus someone who's a paraplegic. How did you utilise that information? Because obviously you wanted to ensure that they were recovered to do their 3 times weekly training sessions and the intensity that you did choose. So do you want to just talk me through that process in relation to the impairment, that the sort of health conditions, and whether or not there are different considerations for the 2 different types of participants?
I can start with the spinal cord injury injured population, or part of our cohort. I'm very lucky to have a supervisor who works in that field, and we also had a medical advisor also from Sunnaas, the rehabilitation center there, or hospital there. So we had good people that could advise us when it came to spinal cord injured participants. So we did do lots of preparation in terms of contraindications to heavy training, with autonomic dysreflexia being one of the things that we were thinking about. Pressure ulcers, obviously, another thing. In terms of recovery and fatigue, I think, like you said, that usually isn't as big of an issue. It can be, depending on the level of injury and stuff like that. We did open, we had it quite contained to below TH6 injury, but then we opened it up because of recruitment issues, but also we saw that we could make the decision on whether we could enroll the participant based on how they were able to perform the program, and whether they had issues with autonomic dysreflexia. Yes, so that's the spinal cord injury side. I mean, obviously, those that had complete injuries where they are paralyzed and they are very much dependent on their upper extremities. We did have continuous contact with the participants also when they were training externally, and with any sort of shoulder issues and stuff like that, which is super important in all wheelchair users, but particularly those that don't have any standing or ambulatory ability, that they get extremely isolated if they can't use their arms. So that was something that we were very much sensitive to picking up if there was something.
And I butt in with, and come back to cerebral palsy, but was that a reason for the dropout? I think was it 27%, and even in your presentation you said you were surprised with quite, the high statistics of your dropout. Was it because of an injury, or was it just because of the protocol adherence and the time, for example?
There was a variety of reasons. There was a couple that enrolled, got randomized to training, started training in like the first week, maybe figured out that they couldn't do it because of pains, for instance, that they were experiencing a lot of nerve pain, so they just weren't able to perform it. We had the rib fracture that I was telling about before was also a spinal cord injured person. That was a classic training accident, so that could have happened without it being a spinal cord injury, we think, but we did discuss it. Could there be something that made that accident happen? Because we don't obviously know for sure. We had pressure ulcers in one pressure ulcer in one person that had, because we did a catch-up method. So if they lagged behind on their sessions, we gave them the opportunity to add on those sessions. And this person kind of did that on their own instead of conferring with us on how to do that. And it ended up being him doing 3 sessions in a row in 3 days. So that was mainly the reasons in the spinal cord injury portion.
And I just wondered, I guess, going back to individuals with cerebral palsy, when you were piloting or getting their sort of, I guess, inferences of their own training, for example, I mean, was there any issues around spasm? You know, when you were trying to put your recovery in, you were sort of getting them up, and then they're sort of having that deloading and then back to training again. Were all of them experiencing positive effects? You know, self-report of how they felt, because again, just working with high-performance para athletes, if we go through that loading phase and then sort of reduce it going into competition, we are tending to reduce it quite a bit more frequently in individuals with cerebral palsy. I just wonder what you noticed in terms of their training response. Was it similar to those who had a spinal cord injury, or was it more notable to be more fluctuating?
Without recalling the exact data, and we haven't looked at all the data, we do have questionnaire data as well on this particular thing, but that we haven't looked at yet. But from reports from the participants, I can't say that I remember that was an issue. We have actual reports of them feeling like the spasms improves. I can't recall that we had anything specific around the deloads or anything like that. But we do have questionnaire data that we can look into.
Yeah. So coming on to questionnaire data then, I'm sure, I can't remember which questionnaire it was. It might even just be maybe just your general physical activity data. You said that you collected something but then didn't report it because you weren't confident with what it was giving you. Could you just remind me what that was, and also whether or not you would now have a solution of what you would measure to be comfortable and confident with using that type of metric in future studies?
So that questionnaire that you're referring to is the IPAC, so the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, which has been sort of translated to wheeling instead of walking and running and stuff. It's a questionnaire that looks at the last 7 days of physical activity, and it's sort of a yes or no. Have you had vigorous activity in the last 7 days? Yes, no. If you have a yes, how many days, and on average or typical length for the activity per day. All of our questionnaires were administered online, typically before test day. So before they were coming into the lab, we would send out the questionnaire sort of a week before, and then so that we could follow up on the test day at the visit whether they had completed the questionnaires or not. And then we tried to follow up after if they hadn't, sending reminders. But because they were doing it online, and because we did have a lot to do, or I had a lot to do. I did have helpers, but I wasn't always on top of double checking that the actual information that they had put in was valid. So unfortunately with that questionnaire, it says, if you're unsure of the time, leave it blank, which means that we didn't have good data. So for most of the participants, it would be, yes, I had high intensity on 3 days, blank for the time, and then the same for moderate and so on. So unfortunately, that data is quite incomplete.
Okay, yeah.
So the second part of the question was, what would I do different? And it's hard to know. Maybe do some of those questionnaires as interview style to ensure that we get that data. But whether that would impact precision, I don't know. And the reliability for, okay, but try to estimate. If you don't know, try to estimate. And then can we trust that? I don't know. The other thing is variables that we touched upon earlier today when we had our conversation. Julia and those in Trondheim working with a wheelchair user wearables, and how can we validate, for instance, Fitbits and stuff like that. And it's getting somewhere, but I think it's quite slow moving. But that might be something. So sort of an actigraph but on the wheel to actually directly and objectively measure activity.
Yeah, and I was reading the introduction piece going into the methods, and that's why I'm really focusing on the methods in relation to wheelchair users. I was quite surprised that you didn't perhaps refer to Paralympic literature. You seem to sort of refer to quite a lot of non-disabled literature. I mean, I know Craig was talking about various, and again, my lack of knowledge of bone, you know, Z scores, X scores, things like that, but it seemed to be that you were making reference to a non-disabled population group. Given the fact that there is an emerging sort of database of, I think you do quote a study that was a Japanese bone health study that was looking at sport participation and bone health. Mm-hmm. Is there some evidence that you could push to be understanding more from the parasport literature rather than the non-disabled literature? Or do you feel that we must be going to that baseline non-disabled literature first? Did you know what I mean, just in terms of...
Depends on what we're looking at, I think. There's quite a lot of descriptive studies, cross-sectional studies, for instance, looking at, like, okay, these wheelchair rugby players have higher density of the arms than the hip, and compared to a non-active wheelchair-using population, yes, they have higher in the forearm compared to those inactive, for instance. When it comes to exercise interventions, there's, as far as I know at least, there wasn't much to compare to. Very often it's spinal cord injured populations, sometimes Paralympic athletes, for instance, that Japanese study, but as far as I know or found at the time, it wasn't much to compare.
No, that's understandable. Like you say, it does tend to be more cross-sectional. It's like this cohort, here's their demographics and values, but like you say, there might be a better database longitudinally to be looking at what changes might we expect or magnitude of change. And I guess that's really what you were looking to do. But just touching upon that then, I know you didn't go into the discussion with Craig a moment earlier around, and if I'm right, you can correct me, is that obviously you had your longitudinal strength and conditioning combined with nutrition and nutrition only, if I'm right on that. And if I scribble down my figures, you've got 30 grams of protein, 800s vitamin D, 250 calcium, in terms of the sort of dietary guidance that went to both groups. Where did those numbers come from? Why 30 grams protein? I'm just challenging you. One, again, going back to the disabilities, the health conditions, i.e., you know, someone who is using a wheelchair, they're using their upper extremities. If you then look at the active musculature to perform activity, it's very different. So surely it would be less than 30 grams, wouldn't it, of protein? My question, I'm just challenging you to respond to that.
I mean, sure, it might be maybe more than what they need in terms of active mass or lower lean mass than ambulatory populations. We didn't see I don't think that it increased the intake all that much. It probably replaced some of their other protein intake. We did see a small increase from baseline to mid-testing, but not a very much amount. And when we look at the relative intake, it's quite good at baseline. So looking back at it, maybe it wasn't necessary, especially in terms of you know, the recommendations, often 1.2 to 1.6 maybe for an ambulatory population per day when you're training. Maybe they don't need all that much. But for the vitamin D and calcium, obviously because we wanted to make sure that they had some intake of vitamin D and calcium, which we know is important in bone remodeling. Or bone metabolism. The actual numbers there was the producer kind of what is possible, what's feasible in a protein powder, what is so that it gets it's not that it's not too much calcium and it gets grainy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that was more sort of a producer decision
Okay.
of those levels, and then we kind of supplemented on top of that to reach the different goals
Right.
that we had.
Yeah. I mean, again, you've mentioned that you have done a nutrition master's and your supervisor's sort of an expert in that area. I guess I was just challenging even just long term of even other sort of supplementations. You're discussing something to go with S&C and your protein, but even with working with power athletes at the moment, I'm thinking, well, should they have the same creatine? Should they have the same carbohydrate sort of percentages that we recommend? And I guess I was just sort of challenging in the sense that if I read something, it's almost like, where has that come from? If it's come from a non-disabled previous paper, it's like,
absolutely.
well, should it? Because the physiology of someone who has a spinal cord injury, cerebral palsy, amputation, etc., is very different.
Yes. And we kind of went with standard protocols to at least ensure that they had, I mean, ensure, it's a bad word, because we were trying to ensure that they had a sufficient protein intake, sufficient vitamin D intake, and sufficient calcium intake, which
makes sense.
Three key things, and also to support a little bit muscle adaptation and to ensure energy intake as well. So those were the things that we're trying to do something with, but vitamin D and calcium was by far the most important things for us to do quite controlled and standardized.
Yeah, and there was no side effects. The participants were happy to take it, and
there's obviously, as you know, a lot of gut issues in the population. It can be from having had a lot of surgery and sitting down a lot and slowing down metabolism and absorption from the gut and everything. So we did have some complaints in terms of the calcium, I think it was mainly, that they were reacting to it a little bit, and we tried swapping out one type to another, but with the same dosage.
Yeah, okay. So you've touched upon a discussion with Craig around the fact that you led the data collection. There was different models of DEXA, but you ensured equipment standardisation. If we just take that a little bit further with the population group, for starters, I'm sort of thinking about surgical implants, metal in the DEXA, and you can obviously account for metal artifact, and things with various calculations. But how sure were you with the reproducibility of scan 1 to scan 2 for somebody who has got curvature, they've got a metal rod in the scan, and you're having to do some corrections before it even goes into the algorithm that the different equipment's going to have in terms of you said there was 3 different sort of DEXAs that were being used. So how confident were you with accounting for the extra complications? And we'll come to some others in a moment.
Yeah. Relatively. But there's definitely some things that make it a bit more, or makes me more unsure.
Yeah.
So the first being that a lot of the participants could not do the standard sort of positioning on the DEXA bench. And that creates issues, obviously. We have a standardization of how to position participants to take images so that we can do it the same every time. So when you step away from that standardization, it's important to write down exactly what you're doing and how you position, what equipment you use, and everything.
You had, like foam inserts and
and then try to replicate that as your new standard, which is, even though we tried our best doing that, I think that is a limitation and probably created some variability. We did do some repeatability measurements in our DEXA scanner here with both ambulatory healthy people and wheelchair users, and we do see a large difference in the
There was more variability, wasn't there, in the individuals who were your manual wheelchair users or your wheelchair users?
Yes.
Yes.
Especially at the hip.
Yeah.
So
and was that greater than the meaningful clinical difference? Because I think I saw some 4% values for your coefficient of variability in those areas relative to 1 or 2% in your non-disabled individuals. So
yeah, and actually even greater at the hip.
Okay.
So I think that might be the numbers for the spine. I think it was greater at the hip. So because the hip is even more difficult. I mean, the spine is the spine. Almost. So if your legs are like this or like this, if you have some bend in the knee, and if not, the spine doesn't, it can change. Don't get me wrong, it does change, but it's not that much. But if the hip is moved from this position to this position to this position to knees out, that creates a lot of variation in that image, in that scan.
And if I'm correct, because I think we have a lunar DEXA at Loughborough, is that whether it's athletic population, I don't know, but sometimes people with tetraplegia or high-level lesion, they tend to be quite large. Did anybody not fit within the usual regional sections? Because again, I've had to work with a DEXA specialist who's then maybe combined some scans. Did you have to do that with any of your participants because of either they were too wide or too long to go on the DEXA bed?
Yeah, we did have issues with, or we did have a challenge with some participants, especially maybe some of the more active ones that were sports active, men who are a bit more wide over the shoulders and stuff, getting their arms on the inside of the region of interest. We did try to, I mean, if you have one arm outside, the machine would automatically just mirror the other arm, right? And estimate for that arm that is missing. And we did some of that manually as well, but we didn't use any specialists to sort of combine images or anything like that.
I was just thinking because obviously
but I know that's one way of doing it.
You have more asymmetries in this population, aren't you, than ourselves?
Exactly, large variation there. So the mirroring is absolutely not optimal.
Yeah, and because I didn't scrutinise it, perhaps in your PhD, so when you were beginning to look at the bone aspect from the DEXA, was that from the whole body DEXA, or did you go in and do more regional scans for those site-specific data that you did?
Yeah. We did 3 measurements or 3 scans, a full body scan, a specific for the lumbar spine and a specific for both hips, actually. Yeah, dual hips.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, because I was just looking actually down on here where you sort of said that you had, ideally, you did your inter-instrument calibrations, and typically you were looking for small changes of 2 to 4%. So hence, if you had some values that sat outside of that, and then what the percentage change was as a result of your intervention, did some people fall then outside that percentage change?
Yes, right. of the least significant change. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just quickly looking for my notes now in terms of here to get my logic in my head.
I could just add briefly that another issue with the DEXA that you mentioned, artifacts, which is also handled differently between different DEXA machines. So we have the Lunar Eye DEXA here, we have the Lunar Prodigy in Bergen, and then we had the Hologic in Trondheim. And the Hologic doesn't let you kind of draw out the artifacts, so it forces you to just remove that whole section. And of course, when we wanted to look at the whole body, for instance, if they had metal in the spine, we couldn't use it because we couldn't take out just that section. obviously can't mirror anything, for we only have one spine. But yeah, so there's definitely some issues with this population.
I mean, based on what you're saying there, though, is there some recommendations that you could give manufacturers that if we want to be getting as precise measurements as we want to, because we want to look at the sensitivity of a training regime or something like that, is for them to build the algorithms, the various values? I mean, what would your recommendation be to the manufacturers? Or isn't there really one yet?
I mean, this isn't even just specific to this population, but I mean, the DEXA bench is super tiny. If you're in Norway or the Netherlands, you will almost for certain have your feet outside the region of interest, or the top of your skull. So obviously you can do a total body less head and just like drop scanning the head, for instance. But that is one thing that is both too short and too narrow for most normal people, at least in this country. Doesn't have anything to do with wheelchair users. But for that population, I'm not quite sure. Maybe I know there's maybe still someone in the audience who's doing a PhD on DEXA technology that could maybe chime in after. But maybe now with AI that there's more opportunities to improve that when you're not able to use the standardized positioning. Maybe there's ways to use AI to improve the precision when you need to use other positions to measure.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I'm going to get maybe now down to the last sort of part in terms of your future directions, because I know Craig did promise me that he was leaving me to tease out some discussions there with you. So I get the impression, I was a little bit surprised, but only because I've recently done a neuromuscular electrical stimulation study myself, is that whilst you have it as a future direction, it's maybe not the one that you would do. So I'm just quickly looking to see, I think you had 4... I don't know, let's see which page that was in at the end, down here. Can you remember what you said that you were going to do? Let's have a look. Here we go.
I mean, I do think there's something to it, and for many reasons, and I think it would be very interesting from like a explanatory side of the spectrum. And but
well, I guess it just goes back to the bit in terms of where the need is. You know, what is you're right. I hadn't really thought about the fact that you came onto a bone project, and hence you were looking at bone. But if I look at future research bids for funding in this area, then the main ones are bladder, bladder control, pressure ulcers, neuropathic pain. We're all trying to encourage participants to do exercise to alleviate and potentially reduce the burden on our national service, NHS, medical, etc. But I'm just thinking, where next? If we need to optimise the strength and conditioning protocol, I think you do put in as one of your first bullets, actually, that you put fully supervised interventions to ensure that you get good quality. I think you showed that graph there, didn't you, with the dotted line, saying, well, they did this, so at periods they might have been under-training. Is there something which you could have done some remote training? Certainly when I did the neuromuscular electrical stimulation project, because of health and safety, we had to, whilst I did a home-based study, every single session was via Teams.
Yeah.
There could be some simple solutions that you have to still replicate what you did, but you can actually have real time. I'm not there, but I'm watching your session.
Yep.
So what do you think would be an ideal way of ensuring the first bullet point actually around that supervised interventions?
I didn't know the topic of my trial lecture when I wrote that. I think maybe I didn't think so much about the pragmatic way of doing things in that sense. So obviously, like I said in the trial lecture, we want adherence to be high and retention high. So in that sense, if we had supervised training, maybe we would have achieved a better adherence. And when I say adherence, I actually should say attendance, because that's what we measured.
Okay.
In the graph that you're referring to, adherence is correct. Adherence to the training volume or estimated prescribed volume. But also attendance, we see attendance drop in that second half of the study. So maybe the attendance would have been better. Maybe we would have had better control of the training volume, increasing the adherence. Maybe also the quality, the technique. We obviously don't know exactly what it looked like. And we also don't know if they just put in numbers, because we weren't there, right? I'm not saying, I have one of my participants here, I shouldn't say that out loud. But I do trust that they were doing what they said that they did, but we don't know exactly with what quality, and we could have maybe pushed them a bit further with the intensity and ensuring that the intensity was correct and stuff like that. But with that, it comes that they need to come here, or we need to come to them. But like you say, an option today in 2026 is to be online, for sure. And that could have maybe improved adherence in that second half.
Yeah. And when you sort of talk about better alignment between muscle groups that can be recruited in the skeletal regions clinicians aim to preserve, in an ideal world, then, which wheelchair users would you do that study with? Because obviously, surely you wouldn't be able to have such a diverse, it's going to be a lot smaller numbers, but would you specifically go into a particular population of wheelchair users to address that first? Because you mentioned, I think you mentioned something about doing, I think I wrote it down in your presentation, where you had some cable rotations, but only a few people could do that because of their functionality. Did you think that's a starting point to maybe think about looking at it in relation to the Asia, as in you scale your participants to Asia, or the motor completeness versus the sensory, and look to see how people respond? Because it might even explain some of the data that Craig was saying at the end there, in terms of those people that had good bone health in green and in red. That could be purely because they've got more function and they've got their motor complete, or versus motor incomplete.
Yes, for sure. And